Dr. Mark Karris, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
It's great to be here, David. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you on the show. You've written a powerful and engrossing book, The Diabolical Trinity. What led you to write this book?
Right. So the Diabolical Trinity, healing religious trauma from a Wrathful God, Tormenting Hell, and a Sinful Self. It's quite a mouthful for sure.
Yes, really.
Quite an ear. I know it's, but I think, so part of it starts with my own story and my own, what I would call religious trauma. So really religious trauma is really an emerging kind of field.
Well, let's get into your own personal story.
Sure. Well, yeah, I grew up with a lot of, I think every family's dysfunctional at some level. Mine was a little off the charts. My mom was a drug addict. She wound up dying from a drug overdose. A father, mentally ill. My great-grandmother died in a mental hospital. And my younger brother has paranoid schizophrenia, and he'll be in prison for life. So that's the milieu in which I grew up in. And so not religious at all. But then I was I was a cutter, very depressed, had no understanding of what it meant to have a future. Like it didn't even compute. It was so, and then at some point it was culminating to a point of it getting pretty dark in my world, to the point of wanting to kill myself by very twisted means. We'll keep it a G-rated podcast right now. But yeah.
Who raised you? Who raised you?
Sure. So my mom, my parents divorced when I was 6. So stayed with my mom, I think up till about the age of 11. And then a little bit with my dad, and then a little bit with my mom, and then a little bit with my dad. And then, yeah, I think we were out on our own around 18.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was a pretty wild experience. And so within that sort of environment, my twin brother, I have a twin brother, he would tell me about Jesus. I was in a progressive metal hardcore band at the time. I think that music really kind of saved me really when I was younger. And then he would tell me about Jesus, and I'd be like, shut up, F you, I don't want to hear about Jesus, anything like that. And then I had, just fast track here, a lot of wild dreams and experiences, to the point of me being alone by myself. And I remember the last words, I say BC, before Christ, was, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. If you're God, if you're real, show yourself to me. That was sort of the last sort of, and I consider myself a master deconstructionist. I've deconstructed every element of my faith, especially as we fast forward to religious trauma and what I've experienced in the church. But it's hard to deconstruct that experience of being enveloped with a love that transcended my rational faculties and just crying hysterically, and that lasting for quite a bit of time. And that ultimately changed my life into a oneness Pentecostal church. And that was considered a cult by many Christian organizations at the time. Men couldn't have facial hair. Women couldn't even trim their hair, else that would be considered a sin, and they could be in danger of hellfire. I couldn't hang out or fellowship with those who believe in the Trinity, and I couldn't go to college. And it was a very constricting, controlling, yet some loving elements, because community was there. The pastor's wife was a lovely woman, but it took a toll, where I got to the point where I couldn't even drink soda because I thought I would be defiling the temple of the Holy Spirit and thus be in danger of hellfire. So that's how bound up in sort of religion and fear that I was at the time. That's the toll it took.
Yeah, wow. Actually, unless you were a regular listener of the show where I've shared some of my own history, you would know that I have some history in that environment myself, which is partly why I was so eager to speak with you. My grandmother was an evangelist and had a strong influence on me growing up. I my parents had problems, and so I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's house, getting shipped there, and and she was of a, I think she was not did not define herself as Pentecostal, but full gospel, if I recall
Mm,
correctly.
mhm.
One of the splinter groups, of which there were many little minor
Sure.
groups.
Apostolic. Yeah. Full gospel.
Yeah, and but she believed in speaking in tongues and divine healing
Hmm.
and that sort of thing. So and she actually had an influence on where I went to school, so that I went to a lot of fundamentalist schools,
Mm,
both before high school and in high school. Went to a fundamentalist high school,
right.
but I wasn't really traumatized by all of this the way that
Hmm.
you were.
Yeah.
Partly because there were leavening influences for me.
Hmm.
My parents at that time uh, were more liberal. There weren't the tight controls at home. I could
Mm,
go to movies. I could listen to any kind of music that I wanted to. I could
mhm.
read a wide variety of books, so that I always had, even though I had what I felt were like, I gave my heart to Jesus probably more than once, uh,
Mhm.
when an altar call would come up. Um,
Right.
but I would say the um, the positive thing that I took away
Mhm.
from my exposure to that form of a Protestant religion was
Mhm.
an ethical sensibility. I think, that some
Mhm.
kind of sense that it was important to try to be a good person, and also I had experiences that made it easier for me to empathize with other people and listen to their problems, and sort of had that orientation all through school.
Yeah. Well, that's a beautiful experience, and it does show the point that some people's theological and church, you know, treasures are another's theological and church trash. And now I think that there could be healthy religion and healthy spirituality. And it's so interesting that my twin brother lived with me, went through the same experiences that I did. He would say, Mark, I didn't experience any religious trauma. So it's so fascinating, which really is so, I can't wait till research comes out on this. So it's an emerging field of why some people are either predisposed, or what's the correlation, maybe self-compassion or attachment styles. What makes someone predisposed to
Yeah,
experience religious trauma, hearing and experiencing the same thing, but whereas someone else could, like me, really experience that religious trauma?
and your
I
brother
don't
was
know.
your genetic twin and an
Yeah,
identical
yeah.
twin.
Yep, I'm 2 minutes older, but it's just fascinating to me. And I have a hunch, I mean, at least anecdotally, from why me and him that happened. I could just say that for me, I was 2 minutes older, but I was more the older brother that had to take care of my family in the chaos, very
Uh-huh.
sensitive to cues, where my twin brother actually, he was known for just disappearing. He would hide in a room, or he stayed away from any conflict. But I think some people with religious trauma, I just find them to be more sensitive, more open, more expansive, creative, like really take seriously what you're about to tell me, because I really care and really genuinely want to do the
Uh-huh.
right thing. They're
So
very
you sort
sensitive.
of, even though it was only 2 minutes older,
Right, right.
you sort of took on that role of, okay, I'm the
Yeah,
older one. I'm going to be the responsible one.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
So very
yeah,
extra sensitive to other people's pain and suffering, and to want to do something about it. So we're just very sensitive, I think. Um,
yeah. I even
yeah.
I personally, I would also entertain a genetic possibility, even though I think twin brothers, even though we don't fully understand all the ins and outs of genetics, and
Sure.
genetics
Epigenetics. Yeah.
can lead to some very surprising differences. Um, so I would
Yeah.
think that could have played a role too. Um, so let's go down to the road a little further then.
Mhm.
Well, tell us about when and how you self-identified as being traumatized.
Mm, mhm. Actually, I didn't have language about this kind of stuff because it's fairly new. So just in the history here, there's what we call spiritual abuse. So books on spiritual abuse, the understanding of cults, authoritarian leaders misusing their power and coercion and manipulation. And so the trauma coming from that aspect of it. And then we move forward to sort of maybe Marlene Winnell's book, Leaving the Fold. She's sort of a grandmother to religious trauma. And then it got to this understanding that, well, beliefs in and of themselves can be so impactful as to cause this traumatized aspect to it. And so then people started using the word religious trauma. So I knew that I wasn't okay. I mean, I knew my fear response and hypervigilance and anxiety and, demons behind every bush and feeling like I have to go in a room and I have to plead the blood of Jesus, across doorposts because I
Yeah,
was afraid if I didn't, somehow there'd be some negative effects or that, God, if I didn't do the right thing, God could punish me in this life or the life to come. But it wasn't until I heard the word religious trauma. So this was probably 3, 4 years ago. It wasn't until the last few years that an actual definition came about by the Religious Trauma Institute and Reclamation Collective. And I love this definition, if I can share it with your listeners. It's the physical, emotional, or psychological response to religious beliefs, practices, or structures that is experienced by an individual as overwhelming or disruptive and has
yeah.
lasting adverse effects on a person's physical, mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being.
So this has emerged as a known and recognized. We know there are many forms of trauma, and this has
That's
come
right.
into the lexicon now as a
Yes,
rec- recognized form of trauma.
that's correct. Yeah.
You know,
And there's
you know,
a,
I
oh,
refer to
sure,
my
go ahead.
my
Yeah.
my grandmother who came from the Hell and Damnation school of thought.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, Very loving to me. She made a lot of exceptions for me, but for
Mm,
other people in the family, uh, stepkids that she had raised and so on, she would
uh,
pray that God would shake them over hellfire to where they could smell let them smell the fire and brimstone, Lord, and so that they'll come back to you. So
right.
I heard that kind of prayer a lot, and I went to tent meetings and so on, where,
Oof.
yeah, so I saw the whole spectrum, but there were, I guess, these other me, and I've come to realize that I had plenty of problems of my own, although it took many years
Mm,
to recognize some of my own psychological issues.
right.
Um, but I don't really blame any of that on religion per se, although I have to think about that a little bit more. I can't,
Yeah. The
I
deleterious effects, that are embedded in.
because that idea is was planted in my mind. Some of the sermons I would talk about fire insurance. You know,
Mhm.
you might as well believe because the alternative is you're going to go to hell. So it's just fire insurance. Maybe we're wrong, but you'll be glad you had this fire insurance.
Right.
So that idea has always been probably somewhere in the back of my mind, in a time of adversity or something, it gives me pause for thought. Well, you know,
Right. Right. I mean, how could not believe, I mean, it's a weird thing. How could not believing in an angry, punitive, imperfection phobic God who sees all and knows all, and who with a snap of a finger can violently punish us in this life if we do something wrong, and can send us to a place called hell where we literally would not just die and be tortured for a few, we're talking 100,000 trillion billion, like eternal conscious torment. How
Yeah.
could that not inflict any after effects with believing some kind of thing?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Well,
you know, it's
particularly if
yeah,
you really take it in, if you're a sensitive
yes,
person,
yeah,
and I totally can see that.
yeah. I mean, maybe if we think of like an analogy of a kid, I don't know. I mean, think of a parent who would be that authoritarian and punitive, and and then the mom saying, "Dad's going to get you if you don't." Like the kid is just going to carry around that fear and that trauma
Sure.
internally for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe the rest of their lives, as you
Yeah,
say. Yeah.
yeah.
So where were we? Oh, you mentioned cults, and it that had put me, before you mentioned it, but when I read your story,
Mm.
I immediately thought of cults because I've worked with
Uh,
people in therapy who were uh, had been in one sort of a cult or another, and
mm,
and the real the struggles they had with getting out of the cult because of the social support that they experienced there, and the sense that
right.
if they left that community, then they would be totally on their own, and they had never really had that experience of being
Oh
totally
my
on their own.
goodness. Yeah. I mean, listen, we are neurobiologically wired to connect with people. Our
Yes,
brains have evolved to these tribal brains. To leave the tribe would literally mean banishment and death,
right.
right? So we learned to follow the rules and sing the songs and engage in the rituals, and maybe some open creativity was okay, but you couldn't stray too far from the group's norms. And we're left with that. Like, if we leave the tribe of our faith, it's dangerous. But not only is it compounded by the thought that if we left, that not only would we receive rejection from the community and thus being alone, but we could also feel that God would then be against us or hate us or be angry at us. And then if you're a Christian tribe who believes in demons, then people have been so afraid that it can open up their lives to the influence of the demonic realm.
Yeah.
Why? By being disobedient and not listening to quote God's word. So this has a lot of different nuances to these things.
Yeah, I keep coming back to my grandmother, who, when she and my grandfather would get in, he was actually a step grandfather,
Mm,
uh, who she had converted in a tent meeting. He had been a drunkard and a reprobate, as she tells the story,
mm,
and a gambler and so on. And then she led him to the Lord, and he totally transformed his life, but was really under her thumb.
mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
and so when they would get in a fight, and she would she would say, uh, I cast these demons out of you. You're being possessed right now. And, and so she would go
Mm-hmm.
down that path. And that's a
Yes.
very, very much of a double bind to be in, I imagine, when somebody's saying, well,
Yeah.
this is not you. You got a demon inside you.
Yeah. I mean, I talk about this in the book, but I've experienced it firsthand. And I, as a side, just press the pause button. There could be listeners who could be hearing this, and by no means do I want to be judgmental or pathologize people's faith, right?
Okay.
So there could be listeners who really take these theologies and doctrines seriously,
Yeah.
and I just
Yeah.
and all I want to say to that is, I want people to be where they are and who they are. My task as writing this book is there's a population, there's a group of people who are being traumatized by these things, by these doctrines. And you just named another, if there's a pie chart of reasons why people could be affected, there's been people who now they shared this, so it's anecdotally, but they were traumatized because they thought, first of all, that their mental illness, they were possessed by a demon, right? So it created such a fear response within themselves, they could never be okay. They then equated that God allowed that to happen. That gets into another doctrine of God allowing things and planning things and being an uber puppet master who has a control of all things and actions and reactions that happen. But to think that your depression is because of demons, right? That gets into fear, because what door did I open that God would have allowed this to happen? And since
Right.
it's not going away, there must be sin and I must be disobedient. So it's a compounding of shame. And then you have that self-criticism. And you can see how the suffering can be compounded, not to mention a splitting off of one's aspect of self. Because I've been in prayer meetings where someone could feel lust, or they have sexual passions, or anger towards somebody, or depressed. I bind you, spirit of lust, to get out, or I bind you, spirit of anger.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it projects what's inside on metaphysical entities. And what's strange is that sometimes there are ameliorative effects, because if you believe it's a demon and someone in the community touched you and you get the oxytocin and then it was cast out, wow, I feel free. So that can happen. But I think it's a disservice to human beings to not be able to identify and own and accept natural occurring human emotions.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. And this brings another concerning story to mind, which is my mother got cancer and
Mm.
later in life, and she went to a healing meeting with I think I'm blocking on the evangelist's name, but you would probably know the name if
Benny
I
Hinn?
no. Was there a Marjorie Coleman?
Catherine Coleman.
Catherine Coleman, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Mhm.
yeah.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
uh, and and I have a sister as well who called me and said, "Oh, David, Mother's been healed. We just ran around the block together. It's wonderful." And
Mm.
I felt a little guilty because I felt a little reservation. I couldn't
Mm.
fully embrace the idea. Okay, it's all gone. She's healed, and then she had what is it's not called a remission, but when the opposite of a remission. She got sick again,
Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah.
became
Mhm.
symptomatic again.
Yeah, yeah.
And so she suffered feelings of guilt. It's like
Mm.
it's bad enough that you've got this horrible disease and you're dying from this disease. Uh,
Yeah.
but then
Mm.
on top of that, I my faith wasn't strong enough. I wavered, and
Right.
and I let the devil in.
Yeah.
And she
Ha-
suffered from
yeah.
that, and that's really sad.
David, I'm struck by how many stories that you have where I would say religious trauma could be, and its effects are very
Yeah,
present.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. And there is, just to throw this out there to listeners, there are what we do call adverse religious experiences. So this is also by the Religious Trauma Institute, that and some other people. But this is how they would define it: any religious belief, practice, or structure that undermines an individual's sense of safety or autonomy, and or negatively impacts their physical, social, emotional, relational, psychological well-being. All that to say, some people can have AREs, but not have religious trauma.
yeah,
But everyone who has religious trauma most likely has AREs. So we
yeah.
can have adverse religious experiences. And oh, yeah, yeah, I went through that. That sucked. But yeah, I wasn't traumatized by it. So just to throw that in there may be helpful for some listeners to differentiate the two.
Yeah, so I'm wondering about, since you say this is I'm surprised to hear that it's as recent as it is for you, that you kind of have recovered. I want to know about
Mhm.
that recovery. How did that happen? How did you come to recognize that that
Mhm.
you had this trauma, and then how,
Mhm.
and were you already a psychologist? Had you already been to graduate school and
Right, right.
developed all those tools?
Mhm. Well, where my story goes is I left, I literally ran away from the cult I was in because I wasn't allowed to go to school, but I felt something. No one on either sides of my family at that point went to college, but I feel emotional even talking about this because I felt the constriction. I felt like I'm meant to learn and grow and see the world,
Yeah,
and so some things happened in the church where there was an affair, and all of a sudden I was in leadership at that time, and the pastor and the pastor's wife were arguing in front of me, and I'll never forget it because it's so visceral for me. But all of a sudden in that moment, I felt a snap in my chest,
yeah,
and that was it. I was done. And I
yeah.
knew
Tore it.
someone in college, and a couple of months later, I was at a college, and it was a very tough experience because I was on the floor in panic attacks, thinking I was going crazy because I came out of that environment. And this was actually a Christian college, but it was a middle of the road. I would consider much healthier college at the time. But I didn't know what was real. I didn't know who was God, who am I, who was really Christian, not Christian, what was demonic, what wasn't. And it was a very tumultuous, disorienting experience, but
Yeah,
wind up being a very healing one down the road.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So again, my question is, say more about the healing experience, the recognition and the healing. So this crisis that you had
Yeah.
was a moment of recognition, would you say?
Well, that got me into another healing environment. I was still inundated with Christian thought, but how things started to unravel a bit, that was sort of, I call it like a season of healing for me, because there were some beautiful mentors, very compassionate, very wise. And then I worked in the Southern Baptist Church at the time because I was ordained in the Southern Baptist Church. And then I went to a more liberal, I got my master's of divinity. Um, and then that opened the door for what we call maybe postmodern, post-structural Christian thought, liberal theology,
Yeah,
liberation
yeah.
theology, feminist theologies. And my whole world started to expand
Wow.
theologically.
Yeah.
And that's when it started to, and by the way, as far as timeline, I received my master's in counseling, okay, 2003, right, then graduated 2007, then master's divinity was after that in 2010. But after that master's divinity, that's when things started to, the cognitive dissonance could not occur anymore without there being major intrapsychic issues. And I had to be real. I had to be more honest. And I always thought, well, why are people so afraid of truth? Like, I don't want to be afraid of truth anymore. Well, I mean, part of me understands because they would, as I was questioning theology, I was called a heretic. I was told I was going to burn in hell. I told that, Mark, you know who else doubted God? Uh, was Satan. You know, if you go back to the Garden of,
Oh, yeah.
with Adam and Eve,
Yeah.
hath God really said that this is true? So total fear responses, but that started really unraveling things, being able to see, no, I'm going for truth at all costs. And yeah, so a lot after that, but that's a little snapshot of how
Yeah, the
things
whole
went.
doubting Thomas thing is, you get that in your mind as part of the programming, well, I mustn't be a doubting Thomas.
Right. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Because what happens is if I doubt something that was in the Bible, but here, honestly, it's not doubting what was in the Bible, it's doubting what people's interpretation of what was in the
Right.
Bible. But
Right.
they say, well, it is God's word, right? And so their interpretation is quote, the truth. But to doubt that, to doubt thus the Bible, would be doubting God. And thus, if I doubted God, then I would be in cahoots with Satan, and I would, get God's wrath or punishment. I mean, I can't tell you how many people felt that level of fear like myself. And it's very real.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's see. Well, one of the things I'm interested in is that in your bio, you went to, you did work for the Red Cross, and you went to a variety of countries. And were you doing trauma work at this point, or where did this happen in the timeline?
Yeah. My life was quite the story, but I wound up getting married in 2010. My wife was in the Navy. Then we lived in Japan for about 4 years. And with that time, I was working with the Red Cross because I had to keep sane as a military dependent to do something. And then getting trained, and then going to Korea, South Korea. Where else did I go? We went to all different kinds of countries over there, but doing work in Japan and South Korea, and there was another country over there. But just teaching about trauma and stress, and doing that work through the Red Cross, volunteering. So that was cool. Yeah. And then when I came back to
in that environment, were you running into people who were suffering from religious trauma? I guess we're talking about American service people, right?
Right, because I did volunteer as a therapist, which took a lot of paperwork, and it took about 1.5 years for me to finally be able to do that. But yeah, I did group therapy and individual therapy and couple therapy with military dependents, and with the military and their dependents. So within that, it would come up. I mean, it still comes up. It's always come up when that wasn't even my focus. It would come up in, like, let's say their wife was dying from cancer, and they would make statements about how God could allow that. And that gets into sovereignty and free will and the topic of theodicy. How could a good God allow such evil in the world? But then them being angry at God for allowing that to happen, thinking that God orchestrated that, those kinds of things coming up. Right. Yeah. So, but it wasn't until years later that it became more of a niche, if you will. Yeah. And putting words to the language, and more people writing about this, and more books coming out.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, we've talked about the importance of community and so on, and I'm wondering if you've been attacked for writing this book. I would think that would be a danger.
Yes.
Or with all the weirdness in the world, it seems to me like it would be a likely thing to happen.
It is. I experienced this more dramatically with both books. I wrote a book it's called Divine Echoes, Reconciling Prayer with the Uncontrolling Love of God. In other words, if people are praying in their room, Aunt Mary, please be healed. God, help her be healed from COVID and encourage her heart. Does that do anything? So I started investigating, deconstructing, and reconstructing. But with that book, I gave that to, I was attending a church at that time. I gave that book to the pastors, and they read it, and we had a meeting, and they were very firm. Mark, you could never, ever teach in our church. Matter of fact, we really encourage you not to attend here any longer. And I was devastated.
I can imagine.
I thought, I'm a little feisty, but I thought I was trying to be very rational and reasonable with my approach. But it all came down to, Mark, if you question God's word, you're questioning God. And we can't have that kind of influence here. And that was an attachment injury for me. I don't think I fully recovered. Actually, I haven't really attended a church since then, really.
Wow. I'm not surprised.
Yeah, but after that, in this new book, yes, I've gotten emails, I've gotten social media messages. Mark, you're a heretic. You're leading people astray. Mark, you're going to go to hell. Who do you think you are? You think you're all smart, and but you're being
Wow.
used by
Yeah.
Satan right now. And I'm like, oh my gosh. But I'm at the point where we're doing my own work. I can say, listen, they are on the journey where they are. They are they. I am me. This is my journey. I know who I am. I know what my truth is. And my truth is more of, I don't have all the answers and I'm okay with it, as opposed to, I have all the answers and this is
Yeah.
exactly what it is, about metaphysical realities that we can't see, no less. So I can deal with it. I have more resilience in that way, but it still hurts. It's still like a little arrow to the heart when I hear it,
Oh,
especially from
yeah.
friends. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Wow. I'm just looking at my notes here to see if there are other questions that I wanted to ask you.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. One that I gather you're still a Christian.
Ah, I was asked that. It's so weird. In the last 3 days, by different people, whether I am still a Christian.
Yeah.
It gets into. I would definitely say I'm spiritual. Christian, it carries so much baggage with it.
Yeah. It does.
Like even in the Bible, it doesn't, no one, even Jesus never said you had to be called a Christian. That's what people were being called, as those who were like chilling with Jesus. But they did talk about followers of the way. So I like that. I like follower of the way. And Jesus most beautifully represents this beautiful picture of somebody who embodied love, of somebody who was, quote, filled with the divine in such a beautiful way. But I have a bigger picture of, I say, I don't know exactly who God is, but I have this sense that something transcends me. And I always go back to, I don't have enough faith to believe that all of this came about from absolutely nothing. Like nothing, something coming from nothing still, like that's why I can't be a full atheist.
It's a
It just
mind-boggling, but either way.
right. But I'm not too arrogant to say I know exactly how the heck it happened and who the heck was behind the first cause here.
Yeah.
Because there's so much complexity that it just. I know there's the interesting analogy of how in the world could there be a junkyard and millions of years later a working 747 jet could miraculously appear fully
Right.
functioning. I don't know how we can get to this level of complexity if there's not a divine lore in some way moving things into a certain telos, but is somehow uncontrolling. So there is this, what we call process theology, that the divine is here, is with us, but is not controlling like a puppet master, and thus is a co-created acts in every moment to moment experiencing, which is why I would say God is not in control of all things. And that's a very unhealthy and toxic theology, which many people have, that God is in control of all things. Anything that happens is because God has a reason. I just can't buy into that when women are raped and babies are raped and cut up and thrown in a ditch, and somehow that was
Right.
God's plan. And I
Right.
just can't
Right.
understand it. But so all that to say, I believe in something that transcends but is imminent. I say it like this. It goes from an author called Peter Rollins. I'm an atheist, a/theist. I disbelieve in the God that I affirm. Because anytime I affirm God, I'm already committing idolatry. Because my finite brain cannot encapsulate who this, whatever you want to define God as.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yet at the same time, there is a theist part within me that says something must be here, as a glue, sort of the ground of all being, or being itself, that somehow, we're all live and move and have our being within. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I know there's a lot of, it's a narrative, there's
Yeah.
beauty. Yeah.
Um, so we know that you don't believe in hell. So the question occurs, do you believe in heaven?
Oh man. Listen, I believe, and just as an interesting point, I talk a little about this in the book, there's a function, there's a communal, especially as I put my sociological hat on, there's a function to these narratives. And even in the earliest form of religion, such as animism, whether maybe it wasn't a god per se, but maybe ancestors could be angry at you in the afterlife, and you have to. So wherever there's humanity, there's religion, and many times where there's religion, there's afterlife narratives, and many times in the afterlife narratives, there's a punitive there's a heaven and hell narrative, and I think there's a sociological function, especially if you think about hell or a punitive afterlife narrative. It encourages the traumatized. So it helps people, tribes, and communities assure them that their suffering at the hands of other tribes and unrighteous individuals would come to an end. Evildoers would be punished. The oppressed would be rewarded with an eternal life with God, right? A very common theme. Then you'd also have the promote community cohesion. If I knew that to disobey this communal rule would result in a divine being angry and punish me, I would think twice, So there's a sociological function. So I have to, if I put that sociological hat with hell, I have to be intellectually honest and say that could very well be true with heaven. I have to be honest about it. But I say, what the heck do I know? I've never been there. I don't know what the heck's going to happen after we die.
Yeah.
Yes, the Bible says that there's a heaven, and I know there's a lot of research now on near-death experiences. I don't know. Listen, I'm a human brain with a small brain. I don't know what's going on with these metaphysical realities after we die. Can I say that I hope there is, if there's a being that transcends and that yet includes me, that there's some afterlife experience that has anything to do with love and goodness and truth and beauty? That's cool. But I couldn't say definitively if that was the case. I could
Yeah.
say it's a
Yeah.
hope.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I can definitely relate to that.
Mm.
Um, uh, I had another thought, but what was I just thinking? Oh yeah, something I wanted, a treatment. I wanted to ask you about altered states of consciousness. I've
Mm.
long been interested in altered states of consciousness, and um, and uh, and I, and I link it to religious conversion. One thing is,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that's known to work for people who were suffering from an addiction, alcoholism, or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
is is if they had a powerful conversion experience
Right.
that somehow would allow them to just change their life radically.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've always been interested in that phenomenon, and even thought, as as a psychotherapist, how would I create that kind of experience? And I looked into uh, I looked into sensory deprivation and sensory
Mm-hmm.
isolation as ways to, and actually,
Mm.
did some pilot studies on my own
Wow.
about
Wow.
about
Mm-hmm.
about that kind of thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, and there was research to suggest that that possibility was out there. And then as time moves along, um, the advent of psychedelic drugs, and then the whole
That's right.
literature on that's followed. We're now in in a place where I'm sure you're aware that there
Mm-hmm.
are psychedelic assisted psychotherapies, and
Right. Right.
I see you've had a lot of trauma training,
Mm-hmm.
and so, and you mentioned in your bio, family systems. I think
Sure.
family. What's the family? It's called family. The idea
Oh,
that we
internal family systems. Yeah. IFS. Mm-hmm.
internal family systems, which is being touted as maybe the lead way to supplement a psychedelic experience with that kind
Mm,
of
mm,
model
mhm.
of thinking.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, so what do you think of psychedelic therapy for people suffering from trauma?
David, I want to try it myself. I mean, I'm hearing such interesting experiences, even with my own client. Just recently, did MMDA. Now I know that's not legal and there's no like protocol for that. I'm like, wow. And I was skeptical. I knew he had an appointment, and I literally get an email after the event. It was 2 days later. Mark, my whole life has changed. I've had an experience non-dual awareness, and I got what I've always been wanting in therapy. Meanwhile, I've been seeing this guy for some time, and I'm
Yeah,
like, that's fascinating.
yeah,
Okay, I want to.
right.
I can't help but feel a little skeptical, just like the church experience, like how long will this last kind of thing.
Right, right.
But yeah, I mean, this is great. I mean, part of me is a pragmatist. Whatever works, works. And
Yeah,
so whether it's just psilocybin and I know ketamine is a big thing, and I got some clients doing that. And people have, yeah, some research, and there's anecdotally it's changed my life.
yeah, yeah,
So I want to try it. I haven't. I'm a little concerned about my brain because there's
yeah,
mental illness in my family, and I'm like, ooh, I don't know if I should try that stuff. But I don't know. It sounds like it's working, and there's training around it.
yeah.
It's going
I
to be
can
more
speak.
protocol.
I can
Yeah.
speak to your concern a bit
Ah. Mhm.
uh, because I have that same concern, and I'm somebody who did in the '60s took a lot of psychedelic. We don't know for sure what they were, but they were purported to
Mm.
be LSD or purported to be something else. But we also, I was never in a sanctioned study, where you knew
Right.
that you knew that you were getting the real stuff. And
Indeed. Indeed.
I've always wondered about that because I don't think
Right.
I don't know that I ever got the real stuff, but I did have
Mm.
I had some very powerful positive experiences that I think helped
Mm.
expand my awareness and belief in the possibility of higher states of consciousness
Mm. Mhm.
and feeling more open to some of the positive scenarios that have been proffered. Uh, but I always found the coming down very rough and went through
Ah. Mhm.
really difficult depression and
Mm.
was just hanging on by my fingernails to keep from
Oh
having to
my
go
gosh.
to a clinic somewhere. And, no, that'll be too humiliating. I'm supposed to be a psychologist and a
Mm.
psychotherapist. I've got to ride
Mhm.
this out. And so I always wrote it out.
Mm.
But I now know more about my genetic history than I knew at the time. I,
Mm.
later discovered that my biological father, who I did not grow up with, uh,
Mm.
he, he uh, he had some episodes. Depression, was hospitalized for depression,
Mhm.
and that I had a grandfather who supposedly died in a hospital of manic
Mhm.
depressive disorder. And so I think, so this is maybe what has been going on in my own life in terms of depression. And I warned I also have the impression that it's more likely to follow the male line genetically. I picked that up
Mhm.
somewhere in graduate school. I don't know if it's been borne out or not. So I warned my sons. I said, look, if you
Yeah.
ever feel like super depressed, just ride it out because there may be a genetic propensity there. So
Mhm. Mhm.
don't act out on it. Just know that, well, okay, this is like some kind of a disease that I'm getting visited by for a little bit, and if I hang on, it'll go away.
Mhm.
And so that makes me I will not take a psychedelic again, even though
Mhm.
I'm excited by some of the stories that I've heard, and
Right, right,
but I know that downside, and I do believe that I believe that if I went to participate in a study, I'd be one of the people that they would rule out because of my genetic history.
right,
You
right,
know,
right.
because
Yeah, yeah.
they're trying to make sure it turns out well. So, so I'm ruling myself out, even though, and I feel a little bit of a loss, because I would like to be able to do it with impunity.
Yeah, without the
But
side effect there.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but I don't think I can.
Yeah,
So, of
some
course,
things
that's
aren't
just
worth it.
it's a decision that you'll have to make for yourself.
I
But
know.
I'm
Yeah.
somebody who's been on the cusp of that decision myself.
Yeah. I had someone just, a friend of mine who's doing breath work certification. Like, I can get to that state without taking anything by doing
Yeah,
breath work. I'm like,
right.
okay. Yeah. So
Yeah,
there's ways to experience some pretty wild stuff without having to take
yeah,
anything.
that's true. That's true.
Mhm.
Well, Mark,
Yeah.
I think we've done it. Is there anything that we haven't said here that you were hoping you'd be able to get across?
Yeah, can I share, this gets on the part 3 of my book on healing. Can I
Yeah,
just talk about that quickly?
sure, sure.
Ah, awesome. I just want to say that in my book is divided into 3 parts. One is looking at the symptoms and the consequences of the religious trauma of hell indoctrination, and that includes this trifold interrelated doctrines, because you can't have an eternal hell without a wrathful God who created it, and you can't have an eternal hell without sinful, evil people to be put there. So it is this interrelation of these 3 doctrines together that comprise hell indoctrination. But part 1 is flushing out the consequences and symptoms, and part 2 and 3 is looking at how do we heal from religious trauma. Part 2 is sort of doing it philosophically and sociologically to sort of wiggle away any particular hell beliefs. But we know with trauma work, it has to be much deeper than that. And so if it's truly trauma, as I say, that facts will not heal the tracks and information does not necessitate transformation. So the trauma of hell indoctrination is lodged in the tracks of the subcortical nervous system. And since trauma's imprint is on the mind and body, we know knowledge alone is not enough to heal it. So part 3, I take 120 pages to have neuroscience-based, very up-to-date contemporary practices and principles for healing, right? So to help people to deal with the chronic shame or the unrelenting inner critic or the unworthiness, the helplessness, the insomnia, the ruminations, flashbacks, nightmares, and disturbing feelings that some people can have with religious trauma. And so some of that is imagination work, some of that is inner critic work, a whole chapter on self-compassion work, because to me, self-compassion is the subversive middle finger to toxic and traumatizing religion, where you may have a God who thinks you're sinful and evil in a community. What better practice than one can have to start loving themselves and to be
Yeah,
kinder and compassionate to themselves? And then a whole chapter on untangling parent wounds, and then a whole chapter on value work. Now that I'm cut off from the mothership of religion, who told me what to do, what to believe, some churches like mine, what to wear, what not to wear. Now that I'm not in that, who am I? What do I want? What do I love to do? What do I don't want? And that gets into the last chapter of the book, talking about values.
yeah. Wow. Okay, that's quite a bit. That's quite a tour that you cover in that book, and it's interesting to reflect that some of these ideas like self-compassion and so on, a lot of this new thinking and therapy comes has its roots in Buddhism,
Mm,
and so there's a religious kind of context again, but it's a different tradition, and
totally. Yeah. And it's
yeah,
been secularized in some ways, but
yeah,
I'm very aware that my Buddhist brothers and sisters and everyone in between does self-kindness and loving kindness and self-love work better than any other tribe that I know of.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, Mark, it's been great to meet you, and I wish you continued good health
Yeah.
and success in your work.
Yeah.
And
Wonderful. Yeah. It's been
thanks
great
for
being here.
yeah, thanks for being my guest
Yeah.
today on Shrink Rap Radio.